Well, they're back. The West Virginia Mountaineers are back in action as Bob Huggins' team picks up a victory in their first game back in really 2 weeks, thanks to, of course, COVID-19, all those games being postponed, and a little bit of an undermanned WVU team as well. But nonetheless, it was not in doubt as West Virginia gets the victory over Kansas State, getting out to a pretty big lead early on, dominating through the first half. Kansas State goes on a little bit of a run early on in the second half, but West Virginia hangs on for a pretty convincing 69-47 victory in conference win over Kansas State. WVU now 10-4 on the year, and Kansas State moving to 5-11. So West Virginia gets into double digits, and quite frankly, they play a basketball game. That's something that many of you have kind of maybe forgot about, and certainly I'm sure my guest and I were kind of waiting to happen again, as I'm, of course, Mike Asti here with the West Virginia Mountaineers edition of Pittsburgh Postgame on Pittsburgh Sports Live. Make sure to head over to WVSportsNow for our postgame recap and all of our postgame coverage. Tom Bragg putting that together over there on the website. Also follow at PGH Sports Live on Twitter and at WV Sports Now on Twitter. And of course, bottom of this video here, click that subscribe button to help us get all our content to you as easy as possible. And I will be joined for this one by Cody Nespor, of course, of WV Sports Now. And Cody, as I said, the Mountaineers get a win. It's really just a positive to even see them playing a game, and it was a national TV game, so they were able to impress on national TV. They get a win over a team that's struggling, but they get a win. And also it's important because prior to the games being postponed, the Mountaineers weren't really riding that high as they deal with a star player leaving the program. They then suffer a loss. They really were dealing with everything negative that could exist and then getting games postponed. So they get back on the winning track despite losing players. They get this win. I'm sure they're confident right now, and Bob Huggins is as happy as Bob Huggins can be, because he's, of course, never satisfied, that I'm sure you just learned on that post-game Zoom. But as we get started here, what's your first takeaway? You haven't seen this team play in a couple weeks. Nobody has. They get a big win, but it's hard to be too high off a win against Kansas State. But certainly they impress, and the conversation would be different if they didn't play this well. So they do, and they win, and now they're 10-4.
Right. I think the biggest takeaway for me from this game is that their defense was probably better than what we saw against Texas, which was their last game before they got shut down. Right. And that's kind of been their foil to start Big 12 play, is just inconsistency on defense. But it was there today. Obviously, this Kansas State team isn't great. But I thought their defense was very, very good, which was something I was nervous about, after them not really even practicing for, 10 or 11 days.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And West Virginia, again, known for defense under Bob Huggins. And we saw a little bit earlier in the season them kind of flirt with getting back to that press Virginia mantra, but not able to do it as often and as long throughout games as they did years ago during that Final Four run, and even years after with Javon Carter and company. But the Mountaineers get the big win. Cody Nespor, Mike Asti here on the WVU postgame show here on Pittsburgh Sports Live, and of course archived forever on WV Sports Now. Cody, what did the Mountaineers do actually on the court? Because obviously Miles McBride hit tons of shots, and that was a big deal. West Virginia out-rebounded Kansas State, and that's a big deal, and Bob Huggins loves that. But they hung on for the win. It did get a little closer than this score maybe shows at times in the second half. But anything you notice schematically that West Virginia did to just dominate that first half? Because I will admit, and I'd imagine you as well, that even though this is a game that you figure the Mountaineers were going to win, we're not accustomed to seeing West Virginia dominate a conference opponent like this. I actually recall when we were wrapping up the football season on our last WVU post-game show here, that Tom mentioned that this team always gets into a little bit of a lull in conference play around this time of year. We saw that before the COVID postponements. Maybe they got out of that, but to shellac a conference team is not really the Mountaineers' way, even if they get wins or in the midst of a great season. So really, what was different in this game that they were able to just kind of dominate it all the way through?
Right, especially on the road games.
Right.
Not kind to West Virginia.
Right.
I think what I really liked, Huggins just said that he didn't like the offense. And they weren't great today. But what I did like is I think they are really kind of starting to get into this four guard or four shooters sets where the only big is Derek Culver, which obviously they've gone to now since Oscar has left.
Right.
And that's what they used in the few games after Oscar left before they paused. And that was again today. And I think they really looked more comfortable today. I think it was a little bit out of necessity that Jordan McCabe started, but I actually kind of liked him in that set as a second ball handler to Miles McBride. I thought they played really well together, even though Jordan isn't the best shooter on the team.
Okay.
And then Jalen Bridges, I think, even just from his first start a few weeks ago, I think he has improved exponentially to where he is a pretty important part when they run these sets with four shooters.
Now, when you mentioned Huggins didn't like the offense, did he elaborate on that at all? What did he not like, and what kind of question was that in response to? Because this was a game that Miles McBride stood out again, especially in the first half. And for me, and I did a show on this that continuously appears evergreen, that Miles McBride is the MVP of this team and deserves national recognition, which admittedly he's now getting with these national broadcasts. He is getting discussed more, but even more so now, with now really being the only legit star on this team that casual fans may be aware of after what they just dealt with a few weeks ago with a player leaving. It might rely on him even more so. We saw in this game, and I will say this before, again, I get your take on his performance in this offense and what Huggins didn't like. As much as he's been the MVP of this team now for, I think, 2 years, and as much as he does deserve national recognition, that could be a concern on how far this team could go tournament time if they're relying on a player like him to be that hot to carry them. It's not necessarily the style that maybe wins in the tournament. But what did Huggins not like about this offense when they do almost score 70 and they have a pretty significant lead throughout?
Yeah, well, he didn't like what Culver had today, which
Right.
I think Culver, he didn't practice. His first practice was on Friday, just yesterday on Friday. So yeah, he was rusty. He only shot 2 of 8. He only scored 8. And really, I mean, if he's not in there, their offense just kind of doesn't work. Because then you have to sub in, either Gabe, who isn't really big enough to be the only forward on the floor, or a guy like Seni Njai, who was all right today, but is a true freshman and wasn't even supposed to play this year. The original plan was for him to redshirt, so he can't really fill Derek's spot. But yeah, I think really it kind of centers around Derek just not having a good offensive game. You think about it, if he has a typical kind of game, scores in double digits, and then, they're into the 70, 75 range as a team, and they blow him out even worse. But again, Derek's first practice was yesterday, so, what can you really expect?
No, that's true. Culver, though, 8 points on the day, 2 for 8. So I get it. 4 rebounds, but you also want to expect more from him rebounding wise, especially again with him now kind of being that rebounding player for the Mountaineers, as they're a little bit undermanned and even more undermanned than they would have expected because of dealing with COVID, which we'll get to in a second. McBride, 18.7 for 12, 3 rebounds and 5 assists. He did have the 1 turnover, but McBride, another solid day. Maybe you'd like to see more than 20 points out of him in a game against a team that is poor defensively and has been so bad in Kansas State. Maybe Huggins is also thinking that's a game great for McBride, but maybe even more out of him in this game because that's more of a game that you'd accept against maybe a better team. I don't know. Huggins obviously very hard on the team. They do win 69-47. The Mountaineers now 10-4. Cody Nespor, Mike Asti here on the West Virginia Mountaineers postgame show here, WVU Hoops edition here on Pittsburgh Sports Live. Once again, head back over to WV Sports Now for the postgame coverage. But Cody, kind of moving forward for the Mountaineers here, this is a WVU team that, again, people probably forgot. They look a lot different than maybe what we saw them right before the games being postponed with, again, losing Oscar. This is a Mountaineers team that moving forward here after this game against Kansas State has a lot more in terms of the conference play, but also a tough one out of conference coming up. Texas Tech Monday night. That's a late one Monday night. That's certainly going to be a rough one for the Mountaineers. Number 12 ranked Texas Tech. That is the best team the Mountaineers have played rank-wise in a while. And then Florida you're gonna, then you're gonna see Florida, Iowa State, Kansas, another top 10 team, of course, despite Kansas losing a few in a row, and then Texas Tech again. It does not get easier for the Mountaineers. So I kind of want to get back to what I was saying a little bit ago. From what you watched today against Kansas State, from what you know about this team, from what we're aware of with COVID-19 affecting things, and with Oscar definitely not being there any longer, what are your thoughts about this team moving forward? The schedule not getting easier moving forward. There's going to be an out-of-conference game mixed in. They're going to have multiple games against top 15 teams, including the top 10 opponent, who's going to be very hungry at that point. They certainly do normally struggle on the road in conference play. Some of those games coming up are going to be on the road, some at home as well. But what are your thoughts now about the Mountaineers after finally seeing them play basketball for the first time in 2 weeks, moving forward, looking at that schedule?
I really kind of like how this team is made up right now. If you think about it, like you mentioned, Deuce McBride's kind of the star, and then you have Derek Culver down low. If you having those two guys have two elite players at center and point guard is a very good blueprint to have success. And then you fill in with role players, which, I mean, Taz Sherman's your guy off the bench. Sean McNeil's your sharpshooter. Gabo Saboyan, your defensive guy. I like a lot of the pieces this team has, and I like how they fit together.
Any concern about depth, though, on the bench?
That's what I was going to say. The problem is, like today, Derek didn't have a good day and he fouled out. There's no plan B, right? It kind of at times this team feels like it's held together by duct tape, to where if Miles McBride doesn't have a great game, okay, who's going to score it for you? If, Culver doesn't have a great game, who's going to defend down low? Who's going to rebound it? And so I do like this team. I like how it's made up. I like how they match up against a lot of Big 12 teams. Even a team like Baylor, I don't think is a mismatch. But the asterisk is everything has to kind of work. Like this isn't this isn't a team that goes 10 or 12 deep. They go really kind of 8 deep, with a couple guys that just eat up 5 or so minutes every game. And there's a severe depth problem, especially in the front court right now. But as long as they can hold it together and as long as things work, I think this is a very good team that could make a tournament run and that could upset some other Big 12 teams.
It's also possible that the COVID 2-week respite for the Mountaineers came at a good time. Mm-hmm. You hate to miss games because of that reason, but it's very possible that everything they were dealing with, you go through the holiday season, top 15 team throughout, really feeling like you're having maybe a great year and better than expectations, potentially a year ahead of schedule, potentially as well. You then get into the first of the year, you get the news of Oscar bouncing, and quickly that turns from him choosing to leave for a while to him definitely gone from the program. Then you get the COVID break, and that's mixed in with playing a little poorly right after the Oscar news. So maybe the break actually was a blessing in disguise for this Mountaineers team. The only negative to it, though, and I think overall they are built how Bob Huggins would want a team to be built going into the tournament. My concern and what I mentioned earlier is the depth, and you kind of touched on there too. And if Miles McBride, as much as he is that MVP for the team, and that's just definitively the case now, if he is not having a hot day, he went 7 for 12 today. If he even mixes that and makes that 5 for 12 or 5 for 14 or 6 for 14, then pretty much anybody but Kansas State in conference, they probably could lose that game, especially if Culver is faulting and he's not dominating the boards and he's not shooting and then he fouls out. If you get all of that, that might be where Bob Huggins' concern was. And if you mix all that together and you get a little bit less than McBride against anybody else, they're going to have problems. The double-edged sword, though, is because of the COVID break, their schedule's even more difficult than it was going to be, and it is really stacked. I mean, they have back-to-back games against Baylor. That's a top 5 team in the country right now, number 2. It could be rough where the Mountaineers could be dropping all the way to, Joey Lenardi seeding them as 10 or 11 by flipping from where they are right now as a 4 to a 6. if they end up dropping a mixture of some of those games in a row, even if they're quality opponents, eventually you got to get some wins. So that is certainly a concern. Anything else interesting that you learned on the Zoom there with Huggins, either about this game or moving forward? Obviously, this game kind of was well in hand. Again, the Mountaineers 69-47 victory, now 10-4 over Kansas State. WVU 14 in the country. I don't think that's going to really help them too much with this win, but maybe it will. They actually moved up in the rankings without playing for a while, so we'll see. We'll see what happens. The rankings have kind of been convoluted with teams missing games. But the Mountaineers do get a big win. Cody Nespor, Mike Asti. Anything else from Huggins in that post game?
So like you mentioned, that the break is a bit of a blessing in disguise. And Huggins won't, he won't come out and say that because he doesn't want to call games off. But right after the Texas game, if we remember, Huggins said this team was down to 4 players 2 weeks ago. And it wasn't all COVID. I mean, some guys were legitimately hurt. Sean McNeil could barely kind of walk without limping. Derek Culver, Huggins said Derek Culver couldn't bend at the waist. He was in so much pain at points. Okay. and you think about, I mean, the Big 12 schedule is grueling.
Yeah.
And you think about in seasons past, and last year this happened, is sometimes they'll hit a point where they're beat up, they're tired, whatever, and they'll lose 3 or 4 games in a row.
Yeah.
Just because the schedule's relentless. So I think if you look, there was the Oklahoma and Oklahoma State road games that they didn't play especially well in either one. And then they came home and lost the heartbreaker to Texas, and guys are beat up. I mean, that's right there. And then I think the next game after that was going to Baylor. So then you're looking at, that's kind of a bad scenario to where that's where you could see a skid start.
Yeah. They might have been beat up physically and emotionally.
Yeah.
Just a little demoralized. You see a player leave your program and then you're losing, then you're not playing as well. I'm sure the players, it's only natural to have them think this might have ruined a really special year. How are we going to figure this out? We have to regroup chemistry. Now we dropped a conference game. So it could have been everything.
Right. And then instead of going and playing number 2 Baylor, they get 2 weeks off. And the downside is they didn't get to practice for 2 weeks. It wasn't 2 weeks of prep.
Right.
But they did get 2 weeks off. They got 2 weeks to get healthier. They got 2 weeks to recover. And the downside is they're going to have to pay that back at the end of the year. Like you said, the back-to-back games against Baylor are going to be particularly tough. But maybe, maybe this break came at the right time. Maybe there was enough positive to make 2 weeks off worth it. I don't know. We'll see. I think this game against Texas Tech will kind of tell us that or not, whether the time off was too detrimental and they're rusty, or the time to recover was a bit more beneficial.
Any thoughts though on this team's hope in getting healthier? Was that mentioned at all? Because you mentioned that it wasn't just COVID that was hampering this team. We talked about the players that were missing from this game. And again, not only is it COVID related, but I'm sure people around the program weren't necessarily freaking out about losing players for this game. This game might be a situation where if somebody's kind of maybe hurt, banged up, or you have the sniffles in the midst of a global pandemic, maybe this is a game you can be okay with sitting somebody out because it is a 5-11 team that you're playing. Granted, nothing is guaranteed, and that's not the Huggins way. But moving forward, we're harping on the schedule. They got, McBride can shoot the lights out at times. He can do everything on the court at times. If he keeps doing that, that's great. You can't always rely on it. Culver, you figure, will be better than what he gave them in this game. Maybe he was just rusty. But they aren't incredibly deep. They are banged up. It's beyond COVID. Any hope of them getting healthier? And how big of a deal is that if they don't get healthier and get more just bodies on the floor, I think is also part of the problem, to give players a rest, maybe Deuce in particular, with somebody who's serviceable every now and then. You couldn't do that today.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the good thing today was they had all 11 scholarship players were available.
Right.
Which is obviously a good sign, because as late as Thursday, Huggins himself told us he didn't know not only how many guys he would have, but he didn't even know who he would have.
That was funny to watch him say that. Yeah.
So having all 11 guys today was good. I believe all 11 got in the game. I think Tosh Thweet only played like 1 minute or so, but he was still in the game. In terms of I think the problem now isn't so much that they're going to be banged up, but some of them aren't going to be in game shape. Like I think Culver kind of obviously wasn't in game shape today.
Yeah, what was he doing the past 2 weeks?
And it's you think they have a quick turnaround to Monday, and is he going to condition all day tomorrow, or is he going to practice all day tomorrow? Is it more important to get him back into game shape quickly, or is it more important to have him prepped for Monday's game? And there's probably quite a few guys who are in similar scenarios where it's do you run them on the treadmill all day, or do you do a walkthrough or do a scrimmage or something like that?
Huggins loves the treadmill.
He does.
Huggins is notorious for the treadmill. And I also think it might be you're going from the road to home, but it might be dependent on when they can arrive. If they get back in there with enough time and then he can throw somebody on a treadmill because that game is late Monday night, he'll have time to treadmill him out the morning and then tell him to rest, or treadmill him out on Sunday and tell him to watch the championship games in the NFL while they're on the treadmill and then let them rest the next morning. So I feel like someone's getting on some treadmill as long as it's wiped down. Huggins is definitely a fan of the treadmill. That's right. Kind of part of his career is throwing players on the treadmill. The Mountaineers get a 69-47 win over Kansas State, now 10-4 on the year. Kansas State loses 6 in a row. So that's the other side of this coin. And again, this might have been the perfect team to play this against, because it kind of was not in any way to call any conference game a practice, but it kind of was like that to see what these players could do, especially with how the first half went. That you heard it on the broadcast, Cody, that I almost was worried we were going to get a broadcaster here fired, because this game was so well out of hand. They were going off into the weeds and some conversations that I was like, dude, I don't know where we're going with this, but it probably wasn't good for themselves personally, with the lead being so well in hand. And Kansas State's a little run there in the early second half. It certainly wasn't enough. We talked about the schedule coming up. Certainly going to be a major test for this program to see what they can do. They're going to lose some of those, but if they can even split those games with Baylor or beat Florida, even though Florida's not ranked, that would be nice out of conference. Kansas is ripe for the picking right now. They're not as great as they were earlier in the year, like the Mountaineers. Seemingly didn't think they were as great as they were earlier in the year, but Kansas maybe is more looking to get that win and get off the snide as well. So we'll see. Before we close up shop here, I do kind of want to get your thoughts just on the overall sphere of college basketball, especially the Big 12 in general. It's been a while since the Mountaineers played, and been a while since the Big 12 saw action, because the Big 12 overall has dealt with COVID-19 maybe more than any other conference in the country. Certainly, it's a conference with several top 15 teams, including the West Virginia Mountaineers, a top 5 team in the Baylor Bears, who West Virginia will see coming up here in a week or so. What are your thoughts about the Big 12 overall this year? Better than maybe you would have thought? Did you expect this? I think it is better than I would have thought. And when you look at how many ranked teams are in the conference, and even if it's not the normal giants like Kansas, a little bit less than maybe they were the last couple of years, you still have several quality teams. Certainly teams are going to be eligible for the NCAA tournament. Does the Big 12 have a case that it is right now the best conference in the overall country, because the ACC is down? I did a Pitt Postgame show the other day. Duke is an unranked team. North Carolina is an unranked team. They're talented, but they're not winning. They're not as good as they once were. That brings the ACC down, obviously. Gonzaga's great, but no one's going to argue their conference is the best. Is the Big 12 the best conference in the country right now? Is that legit to say?
I would think so, yeah. And I would think it'd be kind of hard to argue against it. And the Big 12's a lot better than I thought they were going to be. Texas is miles beyond what I thought they would be.
Right.
Texas Tech is way better than I thought. Oklahoma State is way better than I thought. And then you have Baylor. Everybody kind of knew Baylor was going to be number 1 or number 2 all year. And then even with Kansas struggling lately, we were talking about the schedule. You look at the schedule. There's you have Kansas State, and Iowa State's not great this year, but there's no there's no cupcake games. Like every game.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a tough conference, and it's a good. It's probably the best conference in the country right now. Especially at the top half. is better than the top 5 of any other conference. Easily.
Yeah, you could maybe argue the Big 12 is top heavy, but when you think about it, it's top heavy with 4 or 5 teams deep.
Yeah,
That's how many teams are ranked. So, and it's top heavy with 4 or 5, with 4 of those being top 15, maybe even 6 to 7 in terms of competitive teams that might sniff March Madness. So it is top heavy, but it's top heavy with a lot of quality teams, not just 2 or 3 like normal conferences maybe who are top heavy. And the only ding is when you get away from the top and you get to the bottom, they are really bad teams. Kansas State, again, being 5-11, that's a poor record. But there aren't many of those, and you certainly can't sleep on anybody in this conference. So I think it's better than I would have thought this year. I think it's better than most would have thought this year. And I do think, based on the landscape of everybody else in major conferences who normally would expect to be elite, down, Kentucky, another team, very down. Worst start to a year for John Calipari in his entire career, as amazing as that sounds. So that brings the SEC down overall, in Florida, a team that's a little bit down this year. The Mountaineers are going to see. Cody Nespor, Mike Asti here, wrapping up the Mountaineers' victory over Kansas State, 69-47 win, now 10-4 on the year. And as we close up shop, Cody, to preview that game Monday night, we're not going to be with you for that one post-game, but we will definitely hit more of these post-game shows here for the Mountaineers moving forward. So WVU, Texas Tech, that's another ranked team. That's a top 15 team. That's a quality game for sure. That's going to be a quality win if the Mountaineers can snag it, and certainly could be part of where they are seated, whether it be Big 12 tournament or the NCAA tournament, in getting games like that, especially with it being tougher with Baylor coming up. So that's a winnable game. But what do the Mountaineers need to do to beat Texas Tech? And certainly it's playing better than today, even though they got a win over Kansas State and got it handily. It's going to be rough against Texas Tech. What do the Mountaineers have to do to beat the Red Raiders?
So the story of that game is going to be Miles McBride against Matt McClung. And a lot of people I think would say Matt McClung is the, best or second best point guard in the league. It's really going to be, I think him and Miles McBride are going to be battling it out. Tech, they just postponed their last game, so they might be in a similar, they haven't been off for 2 weeks, but they're going to be in a similar situation where they haven't played in a few days. And I think this is kind of going to be a bit of a prove-it game for both teams, to where whoever wins, it's it's going to be their statement win thus far in the year. But yeah, Miles McBride, Matt McClung, that's going to be the matchup that decides the game on Monday.
And that's another game that Miles McBride will have an opportunity to prove me correct and make the show even more evergreen. And maybe I'll have to do a part 2 to it, that he can show up nationally in another national TV game. He'll certainly receive more national respect because he gets it during the games, but not really much in terms of studio shows outside. He's playing like one of the better players in the country. He's playing like one of the more important players in the country, but he will have a counterpart that could certainly argue being even better than him. And he will need to show up more than he did against Kansas State. Culver will need to show up more than he did against Kansas State as well. That is a top 15 opponent in conference play for the Mountaineers, and they have tougher games coming up, but that is a more winnable game, a game at home as well. So a game the Mountaineers desperately need to win to stay in solid positioning seed-wise. Certainly wouldn't be a bad loss, but definitely a big game for West Virginia as they regroup after this 2 weeks off because of the pandemic, and now going through the rest of this year without Oscar, as once again he is gone from the program. For Cody Nespor, for all of us at Pittsburgh Sports Live, and of course WV Sports Now, where the rest of this post-game coverage will live, including the rest of our coverage of the West Virginia Mountaineers leading up to that game against Texas Tech, and then the post-game wrap of that game. I'm Mike Asti. The Mountaineers get a 69-47 win over Kansas State, now 10-4 on the year. So the Mountaineers get back in action after being off for 2 weeks. They look good. They get a big win. They don't look great. Huggins not satisfied as always. And the big game that really may be a test to the rest of the year, Monday night against Texas Tech, once again on national TV.